environmental safeguards in the name of COVID-19. This has been organized by the Forest Peoples Program, the Tenure Facility, Middlesex University, the Lowenstein International Human Rights Clinic, and the Land Portal. It's my very great pleasure to be the moderator for this event. I'm Jonathan Watts, the Global Environment Editor of The Guardian, the founder of the Rainforest Journalism Fund, and a co-contributor to a new book, Standing Up for a Sustainable World. We have an amazing response to this webinar. More than 1,000 people have expressed an interest in this event, and I think that shows just how important this issue is. More than 2.5 billion people from indigenous peoples and local communities live on and manage more than 50% of the world's land area through customary or traditional systems. This includes some of the most important and biodiverse forests in the world, and numerous studies have shown that, I beg your pardon, and numerous studies have shown that the protection of indigenous and community rights is the most cost-effective and effective way of protecting those areas. Despite laws to supposedly protect those rights, they have formal legal ownership of only 10% of that land that they look after. And another maybe 8% has some degree of government recognized management rights. It's a somewhat precarious situation. And when indigenous and local community rights are not recognized by governments, it can lead to poverty, conflict sometimes, environmental degradation, and there is a growing awareness amongst academics, NGOs, global policymakers that the tenure security of indigenous peoples and traditional communities is a prerequisite for achieving national and international goals for forest governance, also for food security, climate mitigation, economic development, and human rights. So crucially important, but this is contested. Obviously, there are forces we know that resist this and are trying to roll this back. And we are seeing that now. It's since last year and the start of the COVID-19 pandemic. There's been a shift in absolutely everything, and that includes in health policy, the economy, and while people, citizens, are focused on health and financial concerns, some governments are using the pandemic as an opportunity to prevent change or even to roll back policies that could protect and guarantee rights for indigenous people. In some cases, indeed, it's either been the pandemic has been weaponized or been used through a form of sort of malign neglect, and this is having a devastating impact. And before we get much further, I just want to look at very briefly at a victim of the health crisis. And yesterday it was announced by the Brazilian indigenous organization COIAB that the last male member of the Juma people, his name was Aruca Juma, died of COVID. This is an extraordinary tragedy. The Juma used to number 15,000 people at the start of the 20th century, and now the last man in that community has gone. It's the extinction of an entire people. And before we go any further, I'd like us just to have a few moments of silence to remember him and all the other indigenous victims of COVID. Okay, thank you. Now let's look forward. Let's look at how we can analyze the situation, how we can change the situation. Today, we are going to get a summary of the Forest Peoples Program global study, and this will be followed by a discussion amongst our esteemed panelists who come from Brazil, Colombia, Indonesia, and Peru. You, the audience, will be able to participate. We'll be taking questions from you, and we will ask you for a short, there'll be a short sort of online poll very shortly. Before we do that, let me introduce my co-participants, the other panelists. I'll start with Cathal Doyle, who is the author of one of the authors of this paper. He's a senior lecturer at the School of Law in Middlesex University and a member of the Forest Peoples Program Board. Then we come to the other members of our esteemed panel, a very fabulous depth of knowledge from across much of the world. That we have delighted to have Rukka Sambolingi, who is the first female Secretary General of Amman, which is the Indigenous Peoples Alliance of the Archipelago, the world's largest Indigenous peoples organization. Rukka, hello Rukka, is a Torajan from the highlands of Sulawesi. I'm told she is a fiery orator, so we had better watch out. I also know she's got a gorgeous dog. So if her video link goes, we might get a glimpse of that. Next up, we have Raiz Perez, who is the president of the Wampis Nation in Peru. His organization has defended against extractive threats and focused on their own way of development and sustainable conservation. Then we have from Colombia, Camilo Nino. Hello, you and sorry before, hello Raiz. Camilo is the speaker of the National Commission for Indigenous Territories Observatory of Colombia. He is a leader of the Arhuaco people, an ecologist and a master of rural development from the Pontifical University of Javeriana. And then finally from Brazil, we have Viviane Rojas Garzon, who is a lawyer and coordinator of Instituto Socioambiental. She is a political scientist, a specialist on environmental law, and she has worked in the Amazon and on indigenous rights since 1988. Before we get into this, a little bit of housekeeping. This webinar will be recorded. There will be a video available on the Land Portal website later. We have, as I mentioned before, more than 1,000 participants signed up. There will be live tweeting. If you want to hashtag, it's COVID Rollback or Indigenous Peoples. You will be able to send in questions throughout. You should, at the bottom of your screen, see a little button for asking questions. Please use that for questions rather than the chat room. There'll be welcome chat rooms throughout, and it's great to see many of you from all over contributing already. Hello, everyone out there. Now, let's have a quick icebreaker so that we can know who is out there. We'll have an online poll that should appear on your screen and help us to get to know each other. The first question that you should now see is, please can you click and tell us in which region are you based? You should see that up on your screen now. And you see the 5 choices. Please let us know which of those it applies to you. Where are you from? Where are you now? And then you can see, then I'd like you to answer the question, which sector do you represent? Are you from the government, civil society, NGOs? Are you private sector, international organization? Or are you an academic or an other? I guess I would be an other. I think I've been an other all my life. Okay, so I hope you've all clicked on that, and we should quite soon see the results. They should appear on our screen. Okay, let's see who we are, who's out there. Now, it seems like the majority of people are from two regions, North, South, and Central America, 41%, Europe and Central Asia, 44%. So about equal between the old world and the new, as they used to be known. Then we have 11% from Asia Pacific, 4% from Africa, and sub-Saharan Africa, and just one person from East and North Africa. Hello, that one person. Thank you very much for representing your area, and thank you all. Now, and I should say, in case you're curious, I'm from, my region is Pimlico in London, where the sun is coming down and it's a little cool. I hope it's warmer and brighter wherever you are. Now, which sectors? Let's see who you are in terms of sectors. Yes, a good spread, 39% civil society, 21% international organizations, and then also good representation of universities, government and private sector. I think we get the idea here that we have a very diverse audience with representation across a lot of regions and a lot of sectors. So welcome to you all. Now, one more question I'd like to throw at you. And this is, how do you feel about the impact of COVID on nature? A very subjective question in many ways. There's no right or wrong answer here. But do you think that COVID-19 has helped the environment or made the environment worse? And again, there isn't a right and wrong answer. This will totally depend on your region, what kind of habitat you live in, urban or rural, and on how you interpret the environment, how you see nature. So from your perspective, has the environment improved or gotten worse? Let us know what you think. I mean, obviously you might say, the air quality is improved, or I see more deer in the streets, or, all these stories we've heard of how things have changed as humanity's retreated, and there are less cars on the road. So let's hope everyone's answered that, and let's just see that answer. Wow, a total split down the middle. 50% think the environment has improved as a result of COVID, and almost exactly one person more, in fact, says that things have gotten worse. Now, I think this is crucial because this is about perceptions, and it's about distance, because many people in consumer cities, urban cities, feel that there have been gains in the environment because there's less cars on the road, there's less pollution, and also maybe many people who look at the world on a global level can say there have been some gains, because we all know carbon dioxide levels have gone down. But the situation is very different for people on the front line, for those in remote areas often, which is actually perhaps the most important area of biodiversity in the world. And these are areas, of course, where you tend to find traditional communities and indigenous people. And there the picture is much more mixed. Sometimes things might be a little better. Often it's much worse. And in terms of political protection, in terms of support from the services, all of those things can also happen. And that is what we are here to discuss. And so with this, I'd like to hand over to Cathal to tell us the results of the study. What have you found about the effects on Indigenous communities, Indigenous rights?
Thank you, Jonathan. I'm just going to share my screen and put up a few slides as I talk about the report. So good morning, afternoon, or evening to you all, wherever you are in the world, and thank you for joining us. As Jonathan said, I'm going to speak about the global report and its findings and recommendations. And the other panelists are very well placed to speak about the situation in their countries. So early in the pandemic in 2020, Indigenous people started to alert international allies, human rights organizations like Forest Peoples Programme of government plans and initiatives to roll back social and environmental safeguards with very serious consequences for their rights and territories. And given these very concerning reports from the ground, Forest Peoples Programme, our partners and allies, felt it was important to undertake systematic analysis to understand the extent to which this is happening in Indigenous peoples' territories in the 5 most tropically forested countries in the world. FPP therefore came together with the Lowenstein International Human Rights Law Clinic at Yale Law School, with Middlesex University School of Law, and with researchers in Brazil, Colombia, Peru, Indonesia, and the DRC to attempt to answer this question that you see. Since the outbreak of the coronavirus pandemic, to what extent have governments in the world's 5 most tropically forested countries rolled back on environmental and social safeguards? And what are the consequences of this for Indigenous peoples and their territories? So the approach we took was to conduct country studies in 5 countries in collaboration with local researchers and Indigenous peoples organizations. And the research relied on academic journals, white papers, media reports, and importantly, information provided by Indigenous peoples and their organizations to build a picture of rollback in each country. We focused on 4 areas where rollback was being reported. Firstly, macroeconomic policies and land use plans. Second, impact assessment, consultation, and consent seeking processes. Thirdly, impunity for land grabbing, illegal mining and logging activities. And then fourthly, and very importantly, increased levels of violence and criminalization of Indigenous and community leaders. So our findings are very stark. We found clear evidence of rollback in all these areas. Social and environmental laws, regulations, and safeguards have been weakened, purportedly in the name of economic continuity and recovery, with no consideration given to the very profound implications of this for Indigenous peoples and their territories. And the consequences of this are serious in all 5 countries. So this roll guard of safeguards is already affecting Indigenous peoples and the integrity of their territories, and it will continue to do so and to cause even greater harm if not reversed. These rights violations are structural in nature, and they're by no means new. So what we're seeing is business as usual, but its destructive impact is significantly intensified at a time when Indigenous peoples and other forest-dependent communities are at their most vulnerable and unable to defend their rights. Some have put it in this way: harmful business as usual, but this time on steroids. The report has 4 main findings. The first is that governments have prioritized the expansion of energy, mining, logging, and agribusiness activities in or near Indigenous territories in the name of economic recovery, while at the same time weakening safeguards and violating Indigenous peoples' rights. The second is that governments have aided and abetted or turned a blind eye to land grabbing for illegal deforestation, mining, and agricultural activities in Indigenous territories. As a result of this, deforestation continued to surge in 2020 and shows no sign of abating. Third, changes to policies and regulations governing land use to enable commodity production and extractive industries have been rushed through during the pandemic. And these further weaken social and environmental safeguards, including consultation and free prior informed consent. And ultimately, they facilitate the systematic violation of Indigenous peoples' rights. And fourthly, Indigenous peoples who attempt to assert their rights are facing alarming and increasing levels of violence, arrest, and criminal prosecution. So these findings give rise to serious concerns. We expect that these rights violations will accelerate as governments become increasingly focused on pursuing so-called economic recovery at all costs. But such an approach to recovery it's not only ethically and legally wrong, it's also counterproductive and totally unsustainable from an economic and environmental perspective. By undermining Indigenous peoples' land rights, governments are endangering the most effective solution for protecting the world's biodiversity. As guardians of 80% of the world's biodiversity, Indigenous peoples are responsible for a huge portion of the $33 trillion which the World Economic Forum estimates intact biodiversity contributes to the global economy. So protection of Indigenous peoples' rights and tropical forests are inextricably linked. Much of the world's remaining intact tropical forests and habitats are part of Indigenous peoples' territories. And their traditional stewardship and sustainable use of these ecosystems are essential in tackling global climate change. Research has repeatedly concluded that the most effective way to protect forests and biodiversity is to respect Indigenous peoples' rights. However, rather than partner with Indigenous peoples to ensure sustainable long-term recovery, short-sighted governments are instead rolling back rights safeguards, and in so doing are imperiling the customary owners and traditional managers of the world's biodiversity and all of our futures. And we believe that without concerted action to address and halt this trend, further erosion of Indigenous peoples' rights and destruction of the biodiversity and forests in their territories is inevitable. So this year, as we all know, the world's governments will come together at the UN Climate Change and Biodiversity Conferences. And among the most important commitments that they can make at these events is to halt and reverse rights denying and environmentally destructive rollbacks, and to ensure effective protection of Indigenous peoples' rights in their territories. And given the central role which Indigenous peoples' tenure security and traditional knowledge play in combating both biodiversity loss and climate change, it's essential that negotiators at these conferences put Indigenous peoples' land, autonomy, and territorial rights at the very heart of climate change and biodiversity targets, investments, and strategies. So what needs to be done? Well, the report has a series of recommendations, but I'm going to just give you a sample of 4 of those. Firstly, governments of tropically forested countries must reverse these safeguard rollbacks. They must end the criminalization of Indigenous leaders and prosecute those responsible for violating their rights. They need to partner with Indigenous peoples to realize sustainable recovery that respects their rights and protects their forests. Governments in consumer countries, including the US, the EU, and the UK, must consult with Indigenous people to develop human rights and environmental due diligence legislation for their global commodity supply chains and associated finance. They must also use political dialogue and cooperation agreements to influence governments of highly tropically forested countries to reverse and prevent the weakening of environmental and social safeguards, and to ensure effective participation of Indigenous peoples in pandemic recovery activities. International financial institutions such as the World Bank should urgently assess both the risks and the opportunities in COVID-19 recovery and interventions, and develop strategies that prevent rights violations and also directly support Indigenous peoples to strengthen their autonomy and territorial control. Multinational corporations, financial institutions, conservation organizations need to adopt policies and implement due diligence practices in accordance with the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, with zero tolerance for threats, attacks, and human rights violations against Indigenous rights defenders. So in conclusion, Indigenous peoples' collective rights are recognized at the international level. These self-determination rights now urgently need to be realized in Indigenous peoples' forests and territories. States have legal obligations to uphold and protect these rights, and doing so is necessary for Indigenous peoples' survival and for the future of our planet. Indigenous peoples themselves are responding in the face of extraordinary difficulties, and they're doing so by demarcating and monitoring their territories. They're strengthening their self-governance institutions and economic resilience, and they're developing free, prior, informed consent laws and protocols. And all of this is to realize greater territorial control and self-determined development. However, even during a global pandemic, when Indigenous peoples attempt to assert their rights, they experience violence, intimidation, and criminalization. Their governments are failing them. It's our shared responsibility now more than ever to stand with Indigenous peoples and support them in their struggles. As Joanne Carling, Director of Indigenous Rights International, affirms, a pandemic can never be an excuse to trample upon human rights and destroy our planet. Rolling back environmental and social protections in the name of promoting economic recovery is adding insult to injury for Indigenous peoples. So thank you very much for listening, and I hope you'll all read the report.
Thank you, Cathal. Fascinating, horrifying, sobering, and yet very constructive in not just the problem, but what we can do about it. I remember at the start of the pandemic, writing some stories about Brazil and the fears of many indigenous rights groups and environmental groups, excuse me, that the pandemic would be used to kind of push forward more extractive industries in the Amazon and elsewhere. As you say, it's kind of extractivism on steroids, which is horrifying. And governments are failing really on a massive scale to protect Indigenous rights. Now, that was the big picture look at what's happening. Now let's hear from those who are on the ground, who are directly, or contacting people who are directly affected. I want to start with Brazil, partly because it's the place I know best, but also because we've all seen what's been happening there in terms of the forest fires, the deforestation, the violence. We've heard that the environment minister there, Salles, is actually said, let's use this quiet period during the pandemic, by which he means the media quiet period, so that we can push through other types of deregulation, by which he means weakening the rights of Indigenous people. Viviane, can you tell us, has there been an increase in land grabbing since the start of COVID-19? What's happening on the ground?
Buenos días. Bueno, muchas gracias por la invitación. Realmente es un honor poder estar aquí compartiendo este momento. La primera cosa que es importante decir es que la persona que contribuyó directamente con el informe sobre la crisis relacionada con la pandemia y los pueblos indígenas en Brasil es la antropóloga Thais Mantovanelli, que trabajó dentro del informe y que hace parte del Instituto Socioambiental. Rápidamente, para ir al punto, hoy Brasil está enfrentando una crisis grave de aumento de la deforestación, principalmente dentro de los territorios indígenas, que no es una novedad que llegue con la pandemia, pero que junto con la pandemia y la elección del presidente Bolsonaro en una administración abiertamente contra los derechos indígenas ha provocado efectos desastrosos con relación a la garantía de los derechos territoriales, el derecho a la vida y el derecho a la autodeterminación de los pueblos indígenas. Son un conjunto de elementos que caracterizan esa amenaza, pero nosotros nos gustaría sistematizar eso apenas en 2 puntos. Uno tiene que ver con la expectativa de cambio de la legislación. De hecho, una decisión deliberada del gobierno federal de promover cambios normativos, no solamente cambios administrativos a partir de los cuales él tiene competencia y en los cuales ha avanzado en un proceso de desregularización y desmantelación de políticas públicas, así como de enfraquecimiento de los órganos públicos relacionados tanto con los derechos indígenas como con la protección de los bosques y con la protección de los bosques amazónicos. Entonces hay un proceso, por un lado, administrativo que le cabe y es competencia del gobierno Bolsonaro, que ha sido bien ejercido en el sentido de eliminar políticas públicas y enfraquecer instituciones públicas relacionadas a fiscalización, control, protección de territorios indígenas y forestales en general, principalmente en la región amazónica, pero también de los pueblos indígenas como la Fundación Nacional del Indio, que básicamente fue desestructurada y ocupada por personas como, por ejemplo, policías o evangélicos, pastores evangélicos relacionados con campañas de evangelización de pueblos indígenas. Eso por un lado. Y por otro lado, una expectativa real de cambios normativos en el Congreso, sobre los cuales el gobierno no tiene el poder absoluto, pero que están siendo promovidos por el Poder Ejecutivo y que generan la expectativa concreta en los territorios que están amenazados, en la frontera del Amazonas, de que tierras indígenas y unidades de conservación pueden desaparecer legalmente. Entonces, esa combinación entre un ejercicio administrativo restrictivo y la expectativa de cambios normativos ha generado un aumento real de deforestación dentro de las tierras indígenas que sin antecedentes, definitivamente antes del gobierno Bolsonaro, y eso es lo que de hecho ha cambiado actualmente y que fue reforzado por la pandemia. Lo que tenemos es una desmoralización de las tierras indígenas como institutos legales que están amenazados a una reversión normativa y que no tienen más el apoyo de instituciones públicas para su protección. Eso en la práctica se tradujo en un aumento en media en los 2 últimos años de deforestación de 80% dentro de las tierras indígenas, antes del año 2018 cuando ocurrió la elección. Después, con la pandemia, ese proceso de deforestación continuó aumentando y se juntó con el hecho de que inicialmente con la pandemia algunos equipos de fiscalización y de policía que custodiaba y fiscalizaba las tierras indígenas se retiraron del campo. Hubo una presión internacional muy grande sobre el gobierno Bolsonaro para que mostrara resultados en términos de la protección, principalmente del bioma amazónico, lo que se tradujo en un cambio de operadores administrativos de fiscalización. Y eso se tradujo básicamente en que en retirar las agencias especializadas con experiencia en la región que sabían combater la deforestación y los crímenes organizados que están asociados a esa deforestación, básicamente robo de madera, minería ilegal y acaparamiento de tierras, que son IBAMA y Semibio. Ellos fueron retirados del campo en el sentido de que fue disminuidos los recursos para que actuaran y que parte de sus cuadros efectivos también fueron retirados de la línea de frente. Y en sustitución trajeron el ejército de Brasil, que no tiene experiencia en el combate a la deforestación y que usando muchos más recursos que esos órganos especializados no logró efectivamente reducir las tasas de deforestación. Entonces, ese es un poco el escenario general que está ocurriendo en este momento en Brasil en términos de cambio normativo y ejecutivo.
Muito obrigado, muchas gracias, Viviane. Good of you to, you've described how the deforestation has increased, the oversight, the protective bodies in the government have been weakened, and you talked about increased mining. Just a quick follow-up, and I'm just looking for a brief answer, but could you give us an example when it comes to mining? I know that's something that, for example, David Kopenawa Yanomami said to me he's most worried about mining, illegal mining. Is this expanding, and if so, where? Can you just, during COVID, how is COVID affecting the mining situation in the Amazon?
Bueno, hay tres frentes de expansión grandes, que son el territorio Kayapó, los territorios Munduruku y los territorios Yanomami. Voy a dar un ejemplo solamente para tener una dimensión de lo que está ocurriendo. En el territorio Kayapó, el aumento de la deforestación asociada a la minería ilegal de los últimos 4 años, porque no es posible decir que eso es exclusivo del gobierno Bolsonaro, que tiene apenas 2 años. En los últimos 4 años es el doble que toda el área deforestada durante los últimos 30 años por deforestación asociada a minería ilegal. Entonces, nosotros tenemos hoy no más una estructura de minería artesanal dentro de las tierras indígenas, sino una estructura criminal, industrial, de gran escala, que está destruyendo la floresta y los ríos en una escala realmente industrial sin precedentes. El gobierno Bolsonaro el año pasado, en febrero, entró con un proyecto de ley en el Congreso de la República con la promesa de que esa actividad ilegal será legalizada. Y eso estimuló un aumento exponencial, principalmente en sus 3 territorios indígenas.
Thank you. That is a very alarming development that does not get enough international attention. Thank you for raising that, and thank you all as well. Just before we move on, on the chat, there's a lot of constructive comments, a lot of offers of support. So please keep that going. That's really good to see. Let's move now to Ruka in Indonesia. Hi, Ruka. Now, we heard in that report from Kahal that the Indonesian government or parliament has introduced legislation to weaken environmental protections, and has also sort of introduced, or at least accelerated, the concept of indigenous lands as abandoned lands. What's your response to this? How can your organization and others deal with this and turn something bad into something positive, or stop it altogether? Hello? Oh no, did we lose Ruka? We seem to have lost Ruka. My apologies. I hope one of the technical team can try to re-establish a connection with her. We are kind of spread literally across the world here, so this is to be expected. But let's shift, shall we, in the meantime, to Colombia and Camilo. Camilo, hello, are you there? Hola. Camilo, I can see you are on the screen, so I'm assuming you can hear us. Let me ask you a question. I know things are being translated, so there's a little lag. But in Colombia, the report has told us that the government has introduced a change to land use practice, that the government has deprived indigenous people of their customary land rights. Can you please tell us more about this, and how is it affecting people in practice? Uh-oh, Camilo has now disappeared from my screen as well. Camilo, Hello, he's back. He's back, but I cannot hear him. Camilo, hello. Hello, Camilo.
Sí, aquí estoy. Aquí estoy. Buenos días para todos los que
Great,
están.
thank you. Did you hear my question? And can you respond?
Sí. En primer lugar, buenos días para todos y para todas los que están conectados. Tengo un problema de señal intenso porque el tema de conectividad es uno de los grandes problemas que ha afectado el tema de la pandemia. Pero en primer lugar, Colombia ha tenido un tema de cambio legislativo en el uso de los territorios baldíos que ha tenido favoreciendo el tema de la explotación económica por parte de las multinacionales y ha traído como consecuencia que se han ido despojando territorios indígenas, sobre todo los territorios que no tienen seguridad jurídica. El establecimiento de nuevos obstáculos. Esto está basado en dos puntos. El primero tiene que ver con los obstáculos de tipo administrativo, donde bajo el argumento de la pandemia nos dicen que no se puede avanzar en solicitudes en los territorios.
Okay, well, I'm sorry to hear that because that sounded a very important contribution, but hopefully we can reestablish a connection and catch up with some lost ground. This is it's a bit of a massacre of our contributors at the moment, online terms at least. We have 3 of the 4 are offline at present. So until we reestablish a connection with them, I think I'll go back to you, Viviani, if you don't mind. And I on the issue of mining, we know that there's been, from a government level, some rollback, some weakening. I wonder if also Indigenous people's rights and protections and support has been hurt just generally by the lockdown, because support groups such as Instituto Socioambiental and other NGOs, maybe you guys are following the quarantine rules and not going to these areas, but meanwhile, the loggers, the miners, the land grabbers, they're not following any quarantine rules at all, and they're going in. So it's almost open season for them. And I've heard that, you know, for example, in the Xingu area, that, you know, there are moves to start a huge new mine called Belo Sun, and that now that there's kind of no alternatives, maybe some people who previously resisted Belo Sun, they're not hearing an alternative. They're only now being under pressure from mining companies, from those who want to push ahead with these projects, even though these projects will damage their land in the long run. That's all they're hearing, because COVID has actually altered the debate. And I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about that, about the interactions with Indigenous groups and riverine communities in that situation. And then maybe we can go to Camilo, because I think he's back. But Viviani, if you could please go first. Thank you.
Muchas gracias. Voy rápidamente para que no perdamos a Camilo, va que se nos queda otra vez. Pero entonces, rápidamente, tal vez lo más importante que vale la pena destacar es el oportunismo tanto de empresas como del gobierno delante de la situación, de la crisis de salud pública que genera la pandemia. Es increíble que a pesar de esa crisis y de la necesidad del gobierno priorizar esfuerzos en llevar la salud, el atendimiento en salud básica y en llevar información mínima necesaria para el entendimiento de la propia enfermedad y de las prácticas que pueden prevenir el contagio de la enfermedad en contextos culturalmente diferentes y en las propias aldeas donde hay un tipo de convivencia social colectivo diferente. El gobierno no se esforzó en eso, al contrario, el gobierno del presidente Bolsonaro se ha esforzado en un proceso de desinformación y las organizaciones indígenas, una de las cosas más importantes que han hecho ha sido organizarse para producir información tanto sobre los contagios como sobre los óbitos y la forma en que esa enfermedad de hecho afecta a los pueblos indígenas y las informaciones que son necesarias para prevenir el contagio. Eso ha sido hecho a través de organizaciones indígenas. La Articulación de los Pueblos Indígenas de Brasil está liderando un proceso de notificación independiente e imparcial de los datos sobre enfermos y muertes en los pueblos indígenas que ya son subregistradas por el gobierno, que se niega a registrar, por ejemplo, los enfermos y las muertes de indígenas fuera de los territorios indígenas. Entonces, toda la población indígena urbana está fuera de cualquier registro público y ha sido la organización indígena la que lo ha hecho. Por otro lado, las empresas han usado la posibilidad de crear excepciones al cumplimiento de, por ejemplo, protocolos de consulta que exigen consultas amplias con toda la población dentro de los territorios indígenas. Y junto con el Estado ha promovido que sean aplicadas consultas libres, previa informadas a través de medios virtuales. Entonces, están intentando sustituir los procesos de consulta de acuerdo a los protocolos establecidos por reuniones virtuales con algunos líderes que legitiman el avance de autorizaciones ambientales o de autorizaciones administrativas, que es un verdadero oportunismo por parte de las empresas y del propio gobierno.
Thank you very much indeed for that. And a very important point about these virtual meetings instead of face-to-face meetings and the problems that can bring. I'm delighted to say, not only is Camilo's apparently here, but we now have Ruka back with her cat, hopefully. We'll get on to you in a minute, Ruka. Let's first try Camilo, because I asked him a question and he got cut off. Camilo, can you hear us? And can you now answer the question about how the land use practice has changed in Colombia?
Sí, en ese punto estamos hablando sobre el punto en el cambio del uso de tierra, de la cual estamos hablando, es que a nivel mundial ha venido una caída del precio del petróleo y un posicionamiento del valor del oro. Y esto ha llevado a que se empiece una reactivación económica y por lo tanto se afecten los territorios indígenas y que las consultas tengan una gran relevancia en este proceso que está siendo violado. Lo segundo es que se ha desdibujado el derecho fundamental a la consulta previa a un tema de un trámite para el otorgamiento del título de licencia. Es decir, se está convirtiendo en un solo procedimiento para lograr las licencias ambientales mucho más rápida que el ejercicio del derecho fundamental. Y por último, el gobierno quiere minimizar el proceso de consulta porque no brinda la garantía para el cumplimiento del derecho. Entonces, esa es una de las grandes dificultades que en este momento estamos atravesando. Ahora bien, en Colombia tenemos un problema de formalización muy grande, porque en este momento, en la actualidad, están cursando en la Agencia Nacional de Tierra, que es la autoridad nacional para el tema de formalización, 959 solicitudes de formalización de tierras, y algo extraordinario es que el año pasado, 2020, la Agencia Nacional de Tierras atendió 23 solicitudes, que ese fue una ganancia enorme también, un esfuerzo de la institución, pero que es mínimo frente al tema de solicitudes. Por eso decimos que a este ritmo de formalización faltarían por lo menos 47 años para lograr el tema de estas formalizaciones que se tienen. Y con respecto al tema, por ejemplo, del tema de paz, que nosotros los colombianos y colombianas pensábamos que iba a haber un mayor avance significativo porque se firmaba la paz en Colombia, identificamos que no ha habido un avance significativo en la implementación de los acuerdos de paz en lo que tiene que ver con la reforma rural integral. Por eso no existe hoy en día unas claridades sobre cuáles son las inversiones que se están presentando en las entidades para dar respuesta a las solicitudes que hay. Eso sería como en resumen el cambio que en este momento se está dando y no hay una respuesta concreta de parte de los estados frente a las demandas territoriales que hay.
Thank you, Camilo. A quick follow-up to this. You mentioned that the government has slowed down in its process to recognize indigenous land rights, and at the same time, you still have a lot of tension and conflict. And you know, we know also that palm oil, for example, is as you're saying, is expanding. Can you tell us, is this leading to more violence, more conflict because of the sort of instability over who owns the land? And if so, how have you responded? How has indigenous people in Colombia responded to that? Hello, Camilo, are you there?
Sí, ¿me escuchan?
Yes, great.
Buenas. En Colombia, el tema de las consultas previas se ha habido afectada por el tema de la pandemia. Y esto se ha dado porque el Ministerio del Interior, que es garante de la política de los pueblos indígenas, ha venido implementando una serie de prácticas de... ¿Me escuchan? Hola. Hola.
Hello, we can hear you intermittently. I think you need to, maybe if you can talk very directly into the microphone, we can hear you and then not. So.
Hello.
Camilo, I think we've lost you, or on and off. I think if we can try and stabilize your line a bit, I'll try and get back to you. But in the meantime, Ruka is back. At least her dog, not cat, her dog is back. Sorry to your dog. Ruka, it's lovely to see you and have you back. Can you tell us now, the report, Cajal's report has told us that legislation by the government has weakened environmental protections and introduced this concept of indigenous lands as abandoned lands. How have you responded to that? How has it manifested itself in Indonesia?
Thank you very much, Jonathan. In fact, the concept of indigenous land in Indonesia being vacant or is not something new. In nearly all planning processes since the beginning of Indonesia as a country, the reality that 40 to 50 million indigenous peoples occupying about 52 million hectares land throughout the Indonesian archipelago has been ignored by the economic powers that be including government planners. The internationally, that's the term that has been the invisible pupils. And this is due to the fact that we indigenous peoples have not been considered a development asset, but we rather a development liability by the state, and therefore ignored or even intentionally made invisible on maps designed to facilitate land grabbing by corporations. And of course, this is a global problem that is not unique to Indonesia. And we've been talking about a lot about the data desegregation at international level. What the report point is to is the recently passed ambitious consolidating legislation in Indonesia. We call it Omnibus Law on Job Creations. It says job creation, but it is not actually. This law is designed to facilitate local and international investment into Indonesia and reduce the existing few safeguards to protect the rights of indigenous peoples and our environment, our only Mother Earth. But also equally important that the way in which we, the indigenous peoples, interact with our territories and resources is also invisible to the government's planning and resource management actions. The indigenous peoples, in fact, we are self-sufficient and we provide what globally called environmental services. These services are biodiversity protections, watershed protections, and we are keeping massive amount of carbon in our forest. From our maps, indigenous maps in Indonesia that we have in Amman now, it's more than 10 million, nearly 12 million hectares. 63% of these forests are good forests and storing nearly 9 billion tons of carbon. And these are all the carbons like above the ground and under the ground. But sadly, Jonathan, that all these global priorities and programs designed to support the forests or climate at the moment have yet to, into any significant way, benefit indigenous peoples who are actually, who are actually providing these services. And this is because of we are continue being denied our rights as indigenous peoples, and we are continue to be invisible. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Rukai. You made an extremely important point there. I think that indigenous people are not being recognized by governments as a development asset. They're seen as a liability, and this kind of thinking is behind so many of the problems that are faced not just by indigenous people, but by countries. Because as you're suggesting, indigenous people can be part of their economic recovery. They can be part of the solution. Everyone's talking in the world, not everyone, but a lot of governments are talking about a green recovery. Indigenous people should be front and center in this green recovery, and support from them should be part of this green recovery. So I think this is a really fundamental point point that you raised. Sorry, I've got a frog in my throat. Right, we are at the point where we're scheduled to go into question and answer. I hope we've received lots of questions from you in the audience. Please remember you can, not the column on the right, but at the bottom of the screen, you should see a way to send in questions. We've already started to compile one or two, which I will forward, or I will say to the participants that we have here. I would just add, I think this is, thank you to the contributions, thank you to this lovely audience out there, that Camilo was having some technical problems. So if you look at 3:59 p.m., for example, Adam Lun has helped to answer one of the questions I addressed to Camilo on the issue of increased attacks and criminalization of human rights defenders. That there is a map out there showing the links between the two. There's a lot of great resources out there. Maria Arango too has offered resources to help answer the questions. We are having technical glitches, but the humans are working together to try and solve it. Thank you all. So let's now move on to the question and answer section. I have had some of these forwarded to me from Neil Sorensen, who none of you can see, but he's behind all of this organization. So let's start with question number 1 from Michael Rice. This question is an open question to all panelists. Where has the push for deregulation and rights rollback come from? Where has it come from? Is it the case that industry has seized the opportunity to justify rapid expansion to boost the economy? Or is it the case that governments in the study countries already had these plans and they're just using the pandemic to push them forward more quickly? So, you know, they can avoid awkward questions, avoid protests on the streets. So the question is about the drivers behind the trends, the drivers behind the rollback. Is it industry? Is it government? Any of you, Ruka, you missed part, so you're welcome to take that first, or Kahal, if you want a big top-down view on that, or Camilo, Viviani, I'm happy to take any of you. So whoever wants to chip in, raise your hand, and let's take it there. Okay, Viviani is the first to raise her hand. We've got quite a lot of questions, so if people could keep their answers relatively short.
Vamos a rápidamente. En el caso de Brasil se trata de una alianza política con un sector agropecuario de agroindustria. Es una disputa por las tierras indígenas para la producción de commodities. Claramente en el Amazonas, vinculado al Amazonas brasileño, que hoy es el lugar donde se produce más maíz y milho del mundo, y que las tierras indígenas, hay una avaricia sobre las tierras indígenas para que sean también espacios de producción de commodities. Eso es claro.
Thank you. Ruka.
Yeah, thank you very much, Jonathan. That is a very good questions, but I think we all knew the how the corporations have been really taking chances and even make the best out of people are hiding, because we are hiding. We are really hiding. We are on the lockdown after the pandemic started in Indonesia since early last year. The plan is, I could say, the concessions, the plan, the economic concession is already there. And it was already mentioned by the president during the inaugurations earlier in 2019. So the what happened is they pushed through the legislation and they try to make sure that all the deal that they have signed materialized or happening during the pandemic. So that's the problem for us, because when we are on the lockdown and then suddenly we have ongoing land grabbings, the numbers of land grabbings in Indonesia, and also when they're making, they also make the opportunity, they take advantage during the pandemic to really kick us out of the decision-making processes, because there's no way we can participate the public hearings, for example, during the pandemic, because it's just impossible to risk our life to go to see them. And then the other thing, I think it's very important that it's very clear answer from this pandemic that the global economy is failing. The current structure is no longer feasible. We need to restructure. We need we've been talking about paradigm shift for decades. This is the time. This is the time. When the government still dealing with pandemic from the economic perspective, and we are actually unfolding oncoming pandemic in the future. And that's also what the message we received from our elders from indigenous territories. The upcoming pandemic, this pandemic is just unfolding. If we don't change the way we treat our nature, the way we treat our human being, and then we are going further into the catastrophe. Thank you.
Thank you. Another really important point there, that indigenous people and these territories, they are not just a potential part of a recovery and a solution, as you said previously. They are also essential in preventing a pandemic happening again. So this is like a double function. It's right at the center of things, instead of, it's not at the periphery at all. It's at the center of this pandemic, and should be treated as that. Thank you, Ruka. I'm going to try Camilo again. Let fingers crossed. The link is there. I cannot see you, Camilo, unfortunately. Your face does not appear on my screen. So I don't know if you're raising your hand, but I would like to get you involved. So let me just see if we can connect with you and if you can answer this question about what are the drivers of these terrible trends.
Bien, entonces la mano. Bueno, muchas gracias, Jonathan. En primer lugar, en Colombia hay un fenómeno y en este momento se están implementando la zona de reservas industriales. Y esto va muy ligado al tema de la construcción de infraestructuras. Por ejemplo, se quiere hacer y conectar el Pacífico colombiano con la Orinoquía colombiana. Y esto se agrava por el tema de la pandemia. La pandemia ha puesto de manifiesto problemas que se venían exacerbando. Entonces nosotros decimos acá en Colombia que la pandemia mostró la pandemia de lo que está sucediendo en los territorios indígenas. Mientras los pueblos indígenas estamos mirando cómo vamos a enfrentar la pandemia para minimizar los impactos. Por otra parte, el gobierno colombiano ha venido buscando implementar maneras prácticas que no están contribuyendo a la garantía de derechos. Un tema que yo manifestaba era la consultas previas virtuales, que no está garantizando el tema de la participación efectiva. Y un problema de esto es lo que me está sucediendo hoy a mí, con el tema de la conectividad. ¿Cómo van a garantizar un gobierno donde las zonas rurales no tienen conectividad? El 83% del territorio nacional no está conectado. Por eso hoy he tenido problemas. Estoy en una zona donde no tengo participación. Entonces, eso sucede y está sucediendo actualmente. Lo segundo que quiero llamar la atención es que se ha exacerbado el tema de la violación de derechos humanos, que tiene que ver con el tema de los asesinatos a líderes sociales. Por ejemplo, desde que se firmó el acuerdo de paz hasta hoy, han sido asesinados 312 indígenas, de las cuales el año pasado, en el momento en que estamos enfrentando la pandemia, han sido asesinados 114 integrantes de pueblos indígenas, que representan la tercera parte de los casos. Y esto se debe más que todo los asesinatos que se están dando son a líderes sociales que están defendiendo el territorio. Es decir, hay una masacre ambiental detrás de todo esto. Lo segundo, la pandemia también ha llevado a la extinción del mismo conocimiento ancestral tradicional, porque están muriendo las personas mayores. El mayor reporte que se está dando de la muerte por la pandemia son en personas que tienen un liderazgo espiritual. Por lo tanto, hay un erosionamiento tradicional y cultural que se ha venido presentando en los pueblos indígenas. Y en algunos casos ha sido tan grave que ha afectado a pueblos que tienen pocas poblaciones. Actualmente, hace una semana aquí en Colombia murió un gran líder que representaba a muchos pueblos indígenas y ha sido un impacto que se ha tenido. Otro tema que hemos identificado es que ha habido mucho desplazamiento forzado y confinamiento de las comunidades indígenas como consecuencia de la presencia y hostigamiento entre grupos armados por la disputa de control territorial, lo cual ha significado para las comunidades indígenas condiciones de hambruna, exposición masiva al contagio de COVID y pérdida del territorio. Lo siguiente que nosotros hemos identificado en el marco de la pandemia es que los países no tienen la capacidad de llegar a los territorios lejanos. Por eso la conectividad no solamente es el Internet, la conectividad se da porque los lugares no tienen acceso en cuanto a vías, aeropuertos y todo esto está afectando. Entonces, no hay una atención con un enfoque cultural. Hay una disminución en la garantía de derechos de las consultas. Hay intervención en los territorios por parte de las multinacionales. Hay un incremento en la presencia de grupos armados y hay poca respuesta institucional frente a la garantía de la protección territorial. Y hoy día hay una preocupación que debe ser un tema a nivel mundial. Y es que en la Amazonía colombiana, todos los departamentos, todas las áreas periféricas de la Amazonía colombiana está siendo deforestada. Y eso es un impacto que no solamente están afectando a los pueblos indígenas y a los colombianos, es un impacto que va a afectar a la humanidad en general. Y eso es preocupación de parte nuestra. Por eso, desde la Comisión Nacional de Territorios Indígenas, hemos manifestado muchas veces que defender los territorios es defender la vida. Aquí necesitamos unir esfuerzo entre todos y todas en diferentes partes del mundo. Estamos viviendo esto. Escuchaba a la compañera Ruca, ¿qué está pasando allá? Escuchaba lo mismo en Brasil. Por lo tanto, debemos crear un tema de articulación para enfrentar esta problemática. La pandemia hoy está acabando físicamente a muchos pueblos indígenas, pero también la acción y la omisión de parte de los estados en la respuesta institucional no ha sido efectiva, además del tema multinacional en los territorios.
Thank you, Camilo, for a very powerful intervention there. Your descriptions of the military situation, the situation of violence and threats, is very alarming. Also, it's important, again, to stress that point you made about the question of connectivity, and if free, prior, and informed consent has to rely on internet connections. We've seen today very clearly how difficult that is, and in a way it's a handicap for people who live in remote areas, and that seriously has to be borne in mind. And finally, that point you make about the importance of this globally. It's not just a question of communities in remote areas. This is of global importance. This further underscores those points that Ruka was making about the positive contribution that needs to be made, and the central position that Indigenous land rights need to be in as part of a green recovery. No point building lots of wind farms and solar panels in rich countries if you're destroying the forests in Colombia and the Amazon and the Brazilian Amazon. I'm just quickly, I think I'll just go to Cajal if that's okay, because unfortunately Raiz Perez was not able to join us today, probably for those same connectivity issues. I can't ask you to speak on behalf of Peru, but you probably are familiar with the situation there from writing the report to some degree. And I just so that we can get a little bit of the Peruvian element in this, as it's an important part of the report. What's your impression that what are the drivers of the trends you're talking, we've been discussing here?
Yeah, it's a shame Raiz can't be here to give his perspectives, because coming from the Wampi Nation, they have a really inspiring story of how Indigenous people is asserting its own autonomy and coming up with solutions to problems that they didn't create, and the states blindness really to the role Indigenous peoples play in addressing these three major challenges. We talked about biodiversity, climate change, but also pandemics, these three challenges that we are going to face as a global community. But in Peru, as in all the other countries, these issues are so structurally entrenched, and to try and unpick whether it's the state or companies, that are causing this rollback, this is always such complicity between both sets of actors, that it's always challenging to try and see where the issues come from. In the Peruvian context, for example, there has been huge devastation of territories in the Amazon by oil exploitation over 50 years. The state and companies have failed to remediate this, and that's my view, having been to these places and worked with some of the communities, that it's probably impossible to actually remediate this. But in the context of the pandemic, what we're seeing is the state-owned Peru Petro, which is a state oil company, coming together with the Ministry of Mines and Energy and saying that the oil and gas sector can be the motor for recovery from what the country is suffering as a result of COVID-19. Again, Indigenous peoples' issues don't even come into the discussion. And yet we're in a context where there are such profound harms that need to be remedied. This is going on, as I said, for 5 decades. I don't think there's anything new here. It's just that Indigenous peoples are in a position where they're less maybe able to challenge this, and it's an opportunism, taking advantage of the fact that the economy is, all economies are suffering, but looking at the old ways of doing things rather than facing these really 3 core challenges that we all face collectively as a global society. And just to link in very quickly to one of the questions I saw around due diligence and why is this important? Well, I think what we're saying in the report and what Indigenous people are saying is that governments that are home to the supply chains for commodities or extractive industry companies, they can play a really important role if they listen to Indigenous peoples in how to develop this due diligence guidance. And things like Viviani talked about the free prior informed consent protocols and laws that communities have developed. Well, if companies were required to respect those in their processes, it would change the whole scenario. And it wouldn't address the illegal activities, but it would at least free up Indigenous peoples, their energy to try and tackle those rather than also be confronted with large scale companies that are coming in and ignoring their rights in complicity, complicit with the state actors. So it's a very complex picture. There's many elements to it, but I think that each different actor can play their part in addressing that and trying to basically empower and support Indigenous peoples who are the main actors here and who are driving these changes and who have driven change in environmental law, in human rights law. They're really the tip of the arrow in making this change happen. And this relates to climate change and biodiversity. So we need to talk to them and see how we can best help them and direct that goes from financial side, technical side, work in collaboration with them. So I didn't get into Peru in that much detail, but I think it's common issues that we're talking about across all of these areas.
Thank you very much indeed. No, I can't expect you to represent another country, but just didn't want them to be completely missed out just because of the technical problems. We've had absolutely heaps of questions. We're not going to be able to answer them all. In theory, there's only 10 minutes left. I think if people are willing, we could run on a little bit. I see that's a suggestion in the comments. But let's try and at least do one more question to everyone, maybe 2 more. Here's a question from a journalist that I'd like to ask the country participants. And it's from Virna, my glasses are not very good, Virna Setiorini of Antara in Indonesia. Please forgive me if I mangled your name. She has asked to all the panelists, is there a win-win solution for economic opportunities and the fulfillment of the rights of Indigenous peoples and deforestation reduction? If so, what is that win-win solution where we protect indigenous rights in the forest and promote recovery and growth and improve rights? Rukka, this is close to your area to begin with. Could you start with the answer on this question, please?
Yeah, hi Firna. Thank you very much for joining tonight. I know it's late now, but thank you very much for making the time. There is no such win-win solution. At this point of time, it is the win for all, or we are all being a loser in the end. Yeah, at this point of time. So win-win solution has been the language that always being used actually to trick us down, because they always say, we'll give you money, you win, we win. Never, there is no such thing. And especially at this time, we see the global economy is collapsing, to be honest. And this is so scary to see it. So now in Indonesia, we have proven as well that the economic valuations of our indigenous territories, as you speak about money from the economic perspective, we are actually contributing bigger amount of money than what those private companies are contributing to our local development. So when we talk about what is next, what is our better life, and I think this is the time that we need to all come together. We are not against corporations, yeah, because indigenous communities in what small scale is also a corporation by itself. But how we do break down all this, and then we can actually build better connection together from us, indigenous peoples, where all the resources are in our territories. How can we transmit that in more equal and better situation, rather than what we have now, which is what we have now is only benefit the few, but the one that is being the companies now, they're very few, but they all in the end become a loser like us if we don't change right now. That's from my perspective.
Thank you. And your perspective, Rukka, had a lot of agreement on the chat room. Several people saying, thank you, yes, it's win-win that got us into this crisis, is Alfred Bronell. Others say, yes, agree, no win-win solution at the time being. There is no win-win, we are living in the age of the Anthropocene. So yes, a lot of support for your view there. So, well, I'd still like to put this question to Camilo and Viviani. Let's slightly rephrase it, and let's just say, what would you see as the best way for indigenous communities to be protected and to contribute to the recovery that everybody needs in our, not just economic, but in our health, in our well-being, in our climate? I think the problem is often we just look at everything in economic terms, and that's always too narrow and always benefits a small group. Well-being is about so much more than how much money you have, obviously. So, Camilo, can you answer that? Can you, if the line is good now? Silence. If you can hear it, I'll try to...
Jonathan. En primer lugar, sí, aquí estoy. En primer lugar, me parece una pregunta muy importante. Hay un tema que nosotros hemos venido exigiendo de parte de los pueblos indígenas, y efectivamente comparto con la pregunta y la sugerencia que nos hacían una persona que está dentro del chat, y es que debemos ser más incluyentes, los territorios colectivos. Hablemos de los territorios colectivos, porque están los pueblos afros en Colombia y otros pueblos que tienen una manera de ver y relacionarse con el territorio. En ese sentido, uno de los puntos muy importantes para salvaguardar la cultura, las tradiciones y a los pueblos indígenas es la garantía al tema de la seguridad jurídica de los territorios. Y eso ligado al tema de la conservación. Por ejemplo, Hoy los territorios indígenas es donde está más del 50% de los bosques de Colombia. Y eso ligado al tema de la problemática que en este momento estamos enfrentando la humanidad, que es el tema del cambio climático. El cambio climático no está distinguiendo si es rico, si es pobre, etcétera. A todos nos va a impactar el cambio climático. En ese sentido, los pueblos indígenas tenemos un conocimiento tradicional para aportar a la adaptación y mitigación del cambio climático. Por lo tanto, aquí debemos incentivar para que los gobiernos de los estados, de los diferentes estados, contribuyan a agilizar los procesos de seguridad. Porque mucha violencia que se está dando en los territorios y en diferentes partes se da porque hay una inseguridad jurídica de los territorios. Y eso se marca, por ejemplo, en el caso colombiano, que nosotros no sabemos exactamente, ni el Estado conoce cuántas tierras le pertenecen. Entonces, en conclusión, mayor garantía de protección de los territorios colectivos redundaría o llevaría al tema de conservar más los territorios. Conservar más los territorios es enfrentar la problemática en este momento del cambio climático. Y eso nos beneficia a todos y todas, la humanidad que en este momento no tenemos para dónde ir. Muchas gracias.
Thank you, Camilo. I wish I could see you to wave at you and nod in agreement with you, but you have my sympathies and appreciation. Viviane, how about in Brazil? Can you give us the most positive outcome you can imagine in terms of the situation there?
Entonces, yo primero quiero declarar que estoy absolutamente de acuerdo con Rupe y con Camilo, y que tal vez el principio de esto sea identificar que no es un problema de indio, no es un problema de los pueblos indígenas, ni la deforestación, ni el cambio climático, ni las pandemias, ni la contaminación de los ríos y de los suelos, es un problema de los indios. Y esa es la primera cosa que tiene que ser hecha. Antes de empezar a discutir cuál es la mejor opción o si hay alguna alternativa donde todos ganan, hay cuentas que no han sido hechas de forma honesta históricamente. Y la cuenta del estado actual del planeta y de los desafíos humanos y globales que tenemos hoy como humanidad en el planeta siempre han estado de una forma desbalanceada, colocadas principalmente encima de las espaldas de pueblos indígenas, de comunidades tradicionales que están en los territorios de frontera, que son los últimos territorios que restaron para mantener un equilibrio planetario. Y esa es apenas una consecuencia que nosotros tenemos que reconocer para hacer alianzas verdaderas, no solo por un imperativo moral y por una restitución histórica que tenemos que hacer como humanidad, pero también por un instinto de supervivencia. Si nosotros no somos capaces de establecer alianzas verdaderas, honestas con los pueblos indígenas, no vamos a tener una chance de mantener una existencia medianamente digna como especie. Y eso no es solo los territorios indígenas, son los pueblos indígenas y su conocimiento. La valorización de eso como parte de una alianza verdadera es la única chance que tenemos los no indígenas. No es por los indígenas, es por los no indígenas y por la humanidad como unidad y como especie, porque definitivamente esa segregación y distribuir el trabajo y el problema como si fuera de los otros no nos va a llevar a ninguna solución.
Thank you very much indeed. That really kind of underscored the urgency of this and goes back to what has become a recurring theme, which is that we really shouldn't be treating this as a peripheral issue in a remote place. This should be a central issue. I must just, we've actually reached the normal end or the scheduled end of this panel, but I just want to continue just for a tiny bit more. First of all, a little housekeeping before I ask for a final comment from everybody. Please check the chat. It has some very useful links to the report itself, which I think is important. I highly recommend you read it. A lot of useful data and information there. There are a number of other useful links and resources that people have kindly contributed. I should stress there is also a survey on what you think of this panel, and please look for that link. And if you have time, it would be great to get some feedback. And then there is an admonition of me, a very gentle one, of where I have failed, and to stress in that I've stressed indigenous, but of course this is not just about an indigenous issue. It's also about traditional communities, riverine communities. It's about Afro-Caribbean descendants in Colombia, or known as quilombolas in Brazil. So this is a, you know, there's a lot of different groups under this umbrella, and I apologize if I've kind of, just for the sake of brevity, if nothing else, tended to stress indigenous rights, but in fact there's a lot more to it than that. I'd like to, I mean, I'm sorry, there are many questions we won't be able to get around to, but I'd like to finish on a positive note, or a forward-looking note, let's say, at least. Yes, okay, you know, we can see the situation is pretty grim, but perhaps each of the contributors we have, the panelists we have, can look forward. This is a big year. It's a year of the Kunming Biodiversity COP. It's a big year of the Glasgow Climate COP. There's a lot going on in terms of corporate due diligence, governments. If the panelists can make one suggestion for international policymakers, or it could be international corporations, or it could be their own governments, if they could stress one thing that they would like to see changed, so that this situation in which indigenous people, traditional peoples, Afro-Caribbean Afro-descendants, at this moment when it's very difficult for their voice to be heard as before, because they can't march in the streets in most countries. The internet connections, as we've seen, are not great. How can we amplify that voice? And what one thing would you suggest to kind of stress for a positive change this year from these sort of international actors, some of whom might be listening in today? I'll start with, let's say, Ruka. Would you mind going first?
Yeah, thank you. I think the decision makers, when we talk about the Glasgow things, they also need to really make a very big decisions. The funding, the opportunity for the future should not be going to corporates again. And this is not only for the country, but also for the big funders that have been funding all these companies so far. What we need to do is we really need to build a better relationship between, as we see now, as we see now in across the globe, that cities are the most unsafe place under the sky today. And the safest place is indigenous territories where we still live in harmony with our nature. This needs to be, we need to build a new relationship. So it's not like we are in the remote area and we are the periphery and you are the central. I think we need to shift that, and then we build better connections, better. How do we live together? How do we still support you? How do we provide you food? And we promise we can feed you. It's not Monsanto that is feeding you now. It is indigenous and local communities who are feeding you now during this difficult time. So this is the lessons of today. And we've proved also in our indigenous community that actually we don't know what people call in the city work from home. We don't know that because we are on lockdown. We produce food, we produce a lot of things. We are actually increasing our harvest during this difficult time. And this is the offer that we can offer now on our hand to the global community. But the first thing is, I want to tell the global leaders that the cheapest and most efficient investment is actually protecting and invest in indigenous people's rights. Thank you.
Thank you, Ruka. Powerful stuff. I'd stress, and if you have a look on the chat, all of these comments are being recorded. You can find a link on the comments. If you miss anything right now, you can catch it later. The last three contributions, and not too long if you don't mind, because I'm sure people have got to a lot of other places to get off to. Cajal, what's your views, your suggestion?
Thank you, Jonathan. I suppose it's simple in a way. It's governments need to wake up to the risks that indigenous peoples are facing, because if they don't, they're going to be complicit in the disappearance of these peoples. So first is waking up to that. And on the other hand, waking up to the value of their knowledge, their traditional knowledge, the services they provide to the planet. And we all know that we're at a point where we need some form of transformational change. It cannot be tinkering around the edges anymore. So the starting point for this, nobody has the solution, but the starting point is to meet with indigenous peoples on the basis of respect and equality, and to listen to what they have to say. And then together we can try to address this problem.
Thank you very much. Viviane, would you mind going next, and we'll have Camilo last.
Yo creo que apenas un principio así básico, es el fin de la unilateralidad. No pueden más tomar decisiones sobre territorios, pueblos indígenas, comunidades tradicionales sin ellos. Ninguna, de ningún tipo. El fin de la unilateralidad tiene que ser un principio.
And I guess that means giving a louder voice in these big international meetings, even if there's no internet, and even if you can't meet in person. Governments are going to have to find ways to do that. There has to be more support. If we're going to live in a more virtually connected world, then support has to happen for that. And finally, Camilo, please, can you give us your suggestion?
Sí,
Camilo, I can see you. I can finally see you.
De acuerdo. Muchas gracias, Jonathan. Efectivamente, estoy de acuerdo con Viviana. Es la intervención de los territorios indígenas de parte de los estados o de las empresas se tiene que construir, concertar, dialogar con los pueblos indígenas. Una política, por muy buena que sea, si estamos hablando de las grandes COP ambientales, se vienen haciendo, tiene que hacerse con la participación de los pueblos indígenas, se tiene que hablar con los dueños de los territorios. Estamos viendo ese fenómeno, por ejemplo, que no se está teniendo en cuenta en las negociaciones del cambio climático, la participación de los dueños de los territorios, sean indígenas o no sean indígenas. De la misma manera, las grandes políticas que se vienen a nivel internacional no está teniendo en cuenta la voz de los pueblos indígenas. Entonces, es un llamado a los estados, a las empresas, que por muy buenas intenciones que tengan, se debe tener presente el tema de los pueblos indígenas. Y por último, exigir a los estados que garanticen la seguridad de los territorios para evitar ese tema de informalidad que existe en muchos estados a nivel de Latinoamérica y a nivel mundial. Entonces, eso sería como un poco el mensaje. Y por último, yo estoy convencido que sí es posible crear un espacio en esta humanidad donde quepamos todos y todas en el marco de nuestras diferencias.
Thank you, Camilo, for that final comment, which is on a lovely, positive, engaging note. I think that's been the tone of this discussion. I've been delighted, despite the technical hitches. Lots of brilliant ideas, some grim reflections. The report itself, please read it. But please bear in mind all of these very positive messages. We have an audience here that is from all over the world, in a wide variety of walks of life. We can see from the chat, which has been, I've enjoyed almost as much as the discussions themselves, lots of positivity in there and mutual support. I think there's a lot of good stuff been going on today in the midst of a bad situation. And I take a lot of encouragement from that. I hope you can all go out with that message that we've heard again and again. Please listen to the voices of indigenous and traditional peoples in the forests and other biodiverse areas. Please consider the positive developmental and health contribution that they can make. Please make them more central in debates. I hope we can all go out and spread that word a little wider. So I'll leave it there, and with a big thank you to everybody, to my fellow panelists, and to all of you out in the audience who've contributed very much to this. I appreciate your participation and engagement, and I wish you all much better times ahead. Cheerio.